Welcome to Mr. Midnight Chiller, where fear begins after midnight. If you enjoy this kind of horror storytelling, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who loves scary stories, and subscribing for more. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I'd love to know how far the darkness travels. My name is Ben, and our family rule was always a game. A silly little secret that felt more like a tradition than anything real. Something my dad had taught me when I was a little kid in our own safe, sunny backyard. He'd get down on one knee, put his hands on my shoulders, and put on this serious face that would always crack into a grin by the end. "Okay, champ," he'd say, "what's the most important rule for when we go camping in the deep woods?" I'd puff out my chest and recite. If I see a daddy that isn't you, I close my eyes and count to 50. He'd laugh and tickle me, saying, "That's right. Even if other daddy promises a whole gallon of ice cream, or says he's lost a puppy, you shut those peepers and count. Loud. It was our thing, a spooky story we treated like a handshake, passed down from my grandfather to him, and from him to me. I never once thought about where it came from. It was just part of our family, like my mom's meatloaf recipe, or the weird way we opened Christmas presents one at a time. So when I had my own son, I passed it on the same way, turning it into a fun quiz during car rides. "Hey buddy," I'd say, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "What do you do if you're by the creek and you see a mommy who looks just like your mommy, but she's calling you from the wrong side of the trees?" His little voice would chirp back. I go, "Nope," and I close my eyes and count really loud to 50. We'd both laugh, and his mother would smile and shake her head, calling us both goofballs. It was a game. It was only ever a game. That's what I believed right up until the weekend. We were set to go to the old family campsite, the very same spot my dad and grandfather had always gone. I was hauling our gear out of the basement storage, the smell of old canvas and mildew filling the air, feeling that good kind of ache in my shoulders from lifting the heavy tent bag. My son was buzzing around my legs, trying to drag his tiny backpack stuffed with toy trucks, and my wife was upstairs making a mountain of sandwiches. I was looking for the old propane stove when I kicked a cardboard box I hadn't noticed before. It was taped shut, dusty, and had my dad's messy handwriting on the side. "Camp stuff don't toss." With a grunt, I ripped the tape off. Inside weren't pots or pans, but a stack of my grandfather's things. There was a brass compass, a few rusting fishing lures, and at the bottom, a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and felt dry, like an old leaf. I sat on the concrete floor, my son momentarily distracted by a spider, and flipped it open. The first pages were exactly what you'd expect. My grandfather had written in neat, precise lines about the weather, the fish he'd caught, the way the pine trees looked in the morning fog. He mentioned my dad as a boy, getting his line tangled. It was sweet, a window into a man I remembered mostly for his rough hands and loud laugh. I was about to close it and pack it away as a nice little relic when I turned a page and the writing changed. It was about halfway through the book. The neat penmanship broke. The words became jagged, frantic, scribbled in so tight they almost overlapped. The ink changed too, from blue to a weird, rusty brown color in places. He wasn't writing about fish anymore. The entry was dated just a few months before he died. He wrote, "It's not a story. I was wrong to make it a story. It watches. It doesn't come from the dark. It comes from the corner of your eye. It learns your walk. It practices your laugh. David saw it once, when he was 7. David was my father." My throat went dry. I read on, my thumb smudging the old ink. "It offers things. It uses your voice. It knows what you want to hear. The rule isn't a game. The rule is a shield. Closing your eyes, it hates that. The counting, the sound of your own voice, it pushes it back. It needs you to look. It needs you to believe it's you." A chill, sharp and electric, shot down my back. This wasn't the grandpa I knew. This was a terrified man writing in the dim light of a lantern. He described a feeling of being copied, a sensation of something studying him from just beyond the firelight, something that looked like a man made of shifting bark and stolen shadow, but could smooth its face into a perfect reflection if you stared too long. The last sentence on that page made my breath catch. "It doesn't just want you. It wants the line. It wants the family." I slammed the book shut. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Down in that basement, with the single bulb swinging overhead, the world felt tilted. My son ran over and bumped into my leg. "Daddy, what's that?" he asked, pointing at the journal. "Just an old book from your great-grandpa," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high and tight. I forced a smile. Go see if mommy needs help with the cookies. He scampered off, and I just sat there, holding the leather book like it was a live wire. It had to be nonsense. My grandpa had gotten old. He'd spent too many lonely nights in the woods. His mind had played tricks. Everyone knew isolation could do funny things. I tried to pack the thought away with the journal, shoving it deep into my own backpack, underneath my socks. I told myself I'd show it to my wife later, and we'd have a good chuckle about Grandpa's overactive imagination. But the words kept echoing in my head. It wants the line. It wants the family. That night, the night before we left, the rule came up again. I was checking the locks on the doors, a normal habit, when I heard my wife's voice from our son's bedroom. She was tucking him in. I paused in the hallway, listening to the soft murmur of their goodnight ritual. She said, "And what's our special camping rule, Sweet Pea?" He recited it perfectly, his voice sleepy and sure. If I see other mommy or other daddy, I close my eyes super tight and I count to 50 super loud. There was a pause. I could picture her smoothing his hair. Then she whispered something else, her voice so low I almost didn't catch it. "That's my brave boy. You remember that. Because the other me, she gets very lonely out there. And she tells lies." I felt frozen in the hallway. That was new. That was not part of the rule. The rule was just close and count. It was a defensive move, a way to shut out something scary. This was different. This was giving the thing a motive, a personality. Lonely. Liar. It made it real in a way it had never been before. After she came out and shut his door softly, I followed her into our bedroom. "What was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The part about her being lonely and lying? She was folding a sweater, not looking at me. "Oh, that's just the part my grandma always added. I guess it slipped your family's mind." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes the way it usually did. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in our normal routine, but combined with the journal, it felt huge. "Did your grandma ever see anything?" I asked. She shrugged, placing the sweater in her suitcase. She just said the woods were old, and old places have their own rules. "It's probably nothing. Now, did you pack the bug spray?" The conversation was over. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to her steady breathing beside me. My mind was a riot. The journal. The new, twisted version of the rule. Was I being ridiculous? Was I letting some old scribbles and family superstition spook me? We'd been to that campsite a dozen times. Nothing had ever happened. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. The sun was shining, my son was bouncing with excitement, and the open road awaited. As I carried the bags to the car, I felt the weight of the journal in my backpack. Part of me wanted to leave it behind, to bury it back in that dusty box. But another part, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, needed to have it with me. Maybe it was a tribute to my grandfather. Or maybe it was a compass, pointing toward a truth I was too scared to face head on. I threw the bag in the trunk. We piled into the car, my wife navigating, my son already asking if we were there yet from the back seat. As I pulled out of our driveway, our safe, ordinary house shrinking in the mirror, everything felt normal again. It was just a family trip. We sang along to the radio, we pointed at cows, we stopped for gas station slushies. The journal was just a book. The rule was just a game. I kept telling myself that as the city faded and the trees began to rise, green and endless, on either side of the highway, the road narrowed, winding deeper into the state forest, towards the specific turnoff my dad had shown me, the one his dad had shown him. The air coming through the windows smelled of pine and damp earth. My son, hyped up on sugar and adventure, was chattering nonstop about the fish he was going to catch, the forts he would build. Then, as we took a particularly sharp turn down a gravel road, he went quiet for a moment. He was looking out his window at the dense, shadowy wall of trees, his forehead pressed against the glass. In a small, thoughtful voice, almost lost under the crunch of the tires, he asked a question. "Daddy." "Yeah, buddy? If the other me is so lonely out there, why doesn't anyone ever go and play with him?" I glanced in the rearview mirror. His eyes were wide, curious, and utterly serious. My wife looked over her shoulder at him, her expression unreadable. I had no answer. The engine hummed, the trees pressed in closer, and the only sound was the gravel pinging underneath the car. We just kept driving, further and further in, and the weight in my backpack felt heavier than ever. The game was over. We were following the rules, but I was starting to fear we were reading from different pages, and the woods themselves were waiting to see how the story would end. The first thing that hits you about the woods isn't the trees, it's the air. It's cool and still and waits for you to make a sound. We bumped down the last rutted track, and there it was, our family clearing. It was exactly as I remembered, a perfect green circle carpeted with soft pine needles, ringed by ancient, towering pines like quiet sentinels. A cheerful little creek chuckled along one edge, the sound instantly cutting through the last of my car-tripped nerves. "We're here!" my son yelled, exploding from the car before it had fully stopped. His joy was contagious. My wife breathed a deep, happy sigh, smiling at me, and for a glorious hour, everything was perfect. The journal, the whispered addition to the rule, my own stupid dread. It all melted away in the simple, sweaty work of making camp. I wrestled the tent poles together, my son helped by handing me the wrong things, and my wife organized the cooking gear with her usual efficient calm. The sun dappled through the branches, birds chirped somewhere high above, and the smell of dirt and pine sap was the smell of childhood. This was right. This was how it was supposed to be. We were home. As the afternoon light started to soften into a golden dusk, I headed to the edge of the clearing to gather some good firewood. My son was busy arranging a battalion of pinecone soldiers by the tent, and my wife said she was going to wash her hands in the creek. I was bent over, snapping a dry branch, when I glanced up. She was standing by the water's edge, not washing. She was just standing there, completely still, looking down at the flowing stream. Her back was to me. The way she stood was so motionless, it didn't seem natural. Not a twitch, not a shift of weight. She was a statue. I straightened up, a bundle of sticks in my arms, watching her. A minute ticked by, then another. She didn't move. A strange feeling, cold and slick, started in my stomach. "Hey!" I called out, my voice too loud in the quiet grove. She didn't jump. She just turned her head slowly, smoothly, and then her whole body followed. Her face broke into a wide, warm smile the instant she saw me. "See anything interesting?" I asked, walking toward her, trying to sound normal. "Just the rocks," she said, her voice light and easy. "The way the water moves around them is so pretty." She held her hands up, wiggling her fingers. All clean, but her hands weren't wet. They were bone dry. Not a drop of shining creek water on her skin. I looked from her dry hands to her smiling face, and the cold feeling in my gut tightened. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and carried the wood back to the fire pit. Maybe she'd just dipped her fingertips. Maybe the sun had dried them already. I was making problems where there weren't any. Night fell properly, and the fire became our world. We roasted hot dogs, my son got marshmallow all over his chin, and we told silly jokes. But I kept noticing the absence of other sounds. No crickets sang. No owls called. The usual nighttime racket of the forest was just gone. It was as if someone had put a glass dome over our clearing. Only the crackle of our fire and the gurgle of the creek filled the space. I tried to ignore it, clinging to our normal routines. Should we tell the other me stories? I suggested, forcing a grin. It was a tradition. My dad would tell hilariously spooky tales about the other him, trying to do mundane things like grill burgers badly or tell unfunny jokes. My wife's reaction was immediate and sharp. "No," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the warm air. Let's not give it any ideas tonight." She looked right at me, and her eyes in the firelight looked dark, the pupils swallowing the warm color. My son pouted, but she was adamant. The tradition, one of the pillars of these trips, was broken. Just like that, the weird quiet of the woods pressed in a little closer. Later, after our boy was zipped into his sleeping bag in the tent, already breathing the deep, even breaths of sleep, she and I sat by the dying fire, sipping burnt coffee. We didn't talk much. The missing sounds of the forest were a presence between us. I kept thinking about the journal, about her dry hands. I needed to know. It was a stupid, desperate idea, but I had to test the water. I cleared my throat. "Remember that time up here?" I began, keeping my voice casual, "when we were first dating and that huge moose charged our tent. I've never been so scared in my life." It was a complete lie. A fabrication. The worst thing that had ever happened was a curious deer sniffing around our food bag. She took a slow sip of her coffee, gazing into the embers. Then she nodded, a small, remembering smile on her lips. "God, yes. I can still hear the snorting. Terrifying. You were so brave." My blood turned to ice in my veins. She didn't just agree, she added details. She believed the lie, or she was pretending to. I couldn't tell which possibility was worse. I just nodded back, my mouth too dry to speak. That's when we heard it. From the black wall of trees just beyond the ring of our firelight, a voice. It was my voice. Not an echo, not a mimic, but my exact tone, my exact cadence, the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. It was a whisper, but it carried perfectly in the motionless air. Psst, hey, over here. Look. Every hair on my body stood up. My wife's head snapped toward the sound. Her face, lit from below by the fire's glow, was a mask of pure shock. I was on my feet, my heart slamming against my ribs. I fumbled for my powerful headlamp, my fingers numb and clumsy, and finally switched it on. The bright white beam cut a tunnel into the darkness, sweeping across tree trunks, over ferns, finding nothing. I panned back and forth, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, for just a fraction of a second, the light caught something. Two small, faint, greenish reflections, set at exactly the height my own eyes would be if I were standing out there. They didn't glow with the warm tapetum lucidum of a deer or a raccoon. They were a sickly, pale green like old lichen. They were there, and then they were gone. Vanished. Did you see that? I whispered hoarsely. She was standing now too, close to me. See what? She asked, her voice thin. There was nothing. An animal. Just an animal. But she was trembling. I kept the light on the spot for a full minute, but nothing moved. The forest offered no explanation. We eventually sat back down, but the peace was shattered. We both jumped at every normal pop from the fire. The idea of sleeping felt impossible. When we finally did crawl into the tent, the close, familiar space felt different. It felt like the only safe container in a vast, watchful blackness. My son slept on, innocent and unaware. My wife settled into her sleeping bag, her back to me. I lay on my back, staring at the dark fabric of the tent ceiling, listening. The nothingness outside was a physical pressure. Then I had a thought, a small, practical, paranoid thought. As quietly as I could, I unzipped my bag and felt around in my own backpack. My fingers closed on a small, metal carabiner clip I used for keys. Moving with slow, deliberate care, I reached up to the tent's main door flap. Inside the zipper pull, there was a small hole. I hooked the carabiner through it and then clipped it to a loop of fabric on the tent wall beside it. It was a lock. A simple, stupid little lock from the inside. I told myself it was for bears, for raccoons, for any wandering creature. But as I lay back down, my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could see the silhouette of my wife beside me. I knew exactly what, or who, I was trying to keep out. The rest of the night passed in a jagged series of shallow dozes and sudden, panicked awakenings where I'd stare at the tent door, expecting to see a silhouette against the nylon. But nothing happened. The deep, pre-dawn hours brought a deep chill, and the need to pee became an urgent, physical demand I could no longer ignore. Gritting my teeth, I slowly, silently, unclipped the carabiner. The zipper sounded like a ripping seam in the perfect quiet. I crawled out into the cold, my breath pluming in the air, and took a few steps away from the tent, my body tense as a coiled spring. The job done, I turned to hurry back to the feeble safety of the tent. And that's when I heard it, her voice. My wife's voice. It came from the other side of the tent, soft and sweet, the voice she used for bedtime stories. She was talking. Not to me. I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the cold ground. I heard my son's name, whispered lovingly. Then I heard her say, "Just out here, sweetheart. Come see the pretty stars with me." A soft, sleepy mumble answered from inside the tent. My son was awake, and she was out here with him. But I had just left her inside, asleep. I was sure of it. My lungs forgot how to work. I stood in the biting cold, listening to my wife soothe our son from outside the tent, while the woman I had just left sleeping not 10 feet away had not made a sound. The most terrifying sound I have ever heard was my wife's voice coming from outside the tent, while my wife's hand was pressed over my mouth. In that instant, the world snapped into a sharp, horrible focus. The cold air wasn't just cold, it was a blade against my skin. The faint glow from the dead fire's embers wasn't light, it was a reveal. I had just crawled back inside, my mind screaming with what I'd heard, and before I could even process it, a shape moved in the dark beside me. A hand, warm and familiar, clamped down hard over my lips, and another arm wrapped around my chest, pulling me close. I could feel her body trembling against mine, a violent, frantic vibration. Her breath was hot and panicked in my ear. She didn't speak. She just pointed, her fingers shaking so badly it was a blur, toward the mesh window of the tent. I followed her gaze. Outside, silhouetted against the dull orange glow of the embers, was a figure. It was kneeling right by the tent wall, its head tilted close to the fabric. It was her, my wife. The curve of the shoulders, the fall of the hair, the the posture of a mother leaning in to whisper to her child. And it was whispering. The voice was a perfect, honeyed copy, seeping through the thin nylon. They glow so pretty like little lanterns. You just have to come see. Follow my voice, my sweet boy. Inside the tent, a small rustle. My son. In his sleeping bag, he was sitting up. His eyes were open, but they looked wrong, glassy and unfocused, reflecting the dim light with a blank sheen. He was asleep. He was sleepwalking. His small hands were fumbling with the zipper of the tent door, working at it with a slow, dreamy determination. He was answering the call. A low, guttural sound of pure rage boiled up in my throat, muffled by my real wife's hand. Every instinct, every cell in my body was screaming to move, to break out, to attack. I tensed to burst forward, but my wife's grip on me tightened with a desperate strength. She pulled her mouth to my ear, her voice the faintest, most urgent scrape of sound. "The rule," she hissed, her words trembling. "We have to do the rule. Close our eyes. We have to count." In that splinter of a second, a war raged inside me. The ancestral command, the shield passed down for generations, said to shut it out, to deny it with closed eyes and a loud voice. But the deeper, older command, the one written in my blood as a father, roared at me to fight, to grab my child and run. I chose. I tore my wife's hand from my mouth and lunged. I didn't zip the door open. I tore at it, the fabric ripping with a sickening sound. I erupted from the tent into the night with a wordless roar, my voice raw and monstrous in the stillness. The thing kneeling outside didn't startle. It turned its head toward me, and in the faint light I saw my wife's face, but her expression was all wrong, a placid, curious look, like I was an interesting bug. Then it moved. It didn't stand up and run. It flowed. One moment it was kneeling, the next it was a streak of dark motion. It swept an arm into the tent, and I heard my son let out a soft, sleepy grunt as he was gathered up. Then it was gone, melting into the black maze of trees with my boy cradled against it. My scream this time had words. "No!" I charged after them, my feet pounding on the cold earth, my breath already sawing in my lungs. Behind me, I heard my wife's cry and her footsteps following. Our headlamps were still in the tent, useless. We ran blind, guided only by the crashing sounds ahead of us, but they weren't the right sounds. There were no snapping twigs, no rustling ferns. It was a different sound, a soft, slithering rustle, like leaves being dragged over smooth ground. The forest itself seemed to turn against us. A branch I'd known was there for years wasn't. A familiar path between two big boulders was choked with new growth. The usual landmarks had vanished, swallowed by the uniform, oppressive dark. We were in a labyrinth, and the thing was the keeper, hurting us deeper. His name! Scream his name! My wife shrieked from behind me, her voice breaking with tears and terror. So we did. We screamed our son's name until our throats were raw, the sound swallowed by the endless, watchful trees. We tripped over roots we couldn't see. Our hands scraped raw on bark as we stumbled and caught ourselves. We were two frantic animals, stripped of all reason, driven only by a primal, consuming fear. Then, during a brief moment where I had to stop, bent over with a stitch burning in my side, I managed to flick on the small flashlight I'd grabbed from my pocket. I aimed its weak beam ahead, sweeping it across the nightmare gallery of tree trunks. And I saw them. For just a second, maybe 30 yards ahead, the light touched them. The thing was not running. It was moving with a strange, gliding motion, its legs seeming to work all wrong. And my son was in its arms, his head nestled against its neck, his body perfectly relaxed. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't crying. He looked like he was being carried to bed after falling asleep on the couch. The sight of that peaceful surrender knocked the last of the wind from me. "Stop!" I croaked, but it was already gone, vanished behind a thicket of pine. We pushed on, but the hope was leaking out of us with every ragged breath. The crashing, sliding sound ahead faded, then stopped altogether. We skidded to a halt, standing in a small, unfamiliar hollow, our bodies heaving. The only sounds now our own desperate gasps and choked sobs. We had lost. The chase was over. The forest had won. We clung to each other, two broken figures in the vast, uncaring dark, the totality of our failure a physical weight crushing us into the dirt. We had abandoned the rule, and we had lost our boy. My wife's whole body shook with silent, shuddering tears against my chest. I had nothing left. No plan, no hope, no strength. I was ready to lie down in that hollow and let the cold take me. Then, from a small grove of younger trees just ahead, a voice floated to us. It was our son's voice, clear, calm, and completely alert. It held no trace of sleep, no fear, no confusion. "Mommy? Daddy?" he called out, his tone bright and almost conversational. "I found the butterflies. They're right here." The words hung in the motionless air. My wife and I went rigid. Our tears stopped. We slowly, painfully, pulled apart and looked toward the sound. There, in a small circle of slender trees, a soft, eerie glow seemed to emanate from the ground itself. And in the center of that glow, we could just make out the small shape of our son, standing and waiting for us, as if he'd simply wandered off to look at pretty lights. The horror of the chase was gone, replaced by a new, deeper dread that sat in my stomach like a stone. He sounded so normal. He sounded like he'd just found an interesting rock. But the words were all wrong. Butterflies. At night. In a grove that glowed. We looked at each other, my wife's face a mask of smeared dirt and stunned disbelief. There was no choice. We had to go to him. Hand in hand, we walked forward, leaving the terror of the wild chase behind and stepping into the quiet, waiting mystery of the grove. They say you never forget the face of your child when they've been lost and found. But I'll never forget his face in that grove. Not relieved, not scared, just utterly, peacefully satisfied. He stood in a perfect circle of skinny, pale-barked trees, the ground covered in a layer of pine needles so deep and soft they muffled our footsteps into nothing. The air here was different, still and cool and empty, like the inside of a cathedral. And the glow came from everywhere and nowhere, a gentle greenish light that seemed to seep up from the soil itself, making the whole place feel like a dream. He was just standing there, waiting, a small smile on his face. He was clean. His pajamas weren't torn or dirty from being dragged through the woods. His face was smudge-free. It was as if he'd been carefully placed there, not taken. "Hi," he said, like we'd just come back from fetching firewood. My wife let out a choked sound, halfway between a sob and a laugh, and ran to him, dropping to her knees and crushing him in a hug. He hugged her back, patting her shoulder. "It's okay, Mommy." She had to go. The butterflies flew away. I approached slower, my eyes scanning the trees, expecting the thing to be lurking, watching. But the grove was empty except for us. "Who had to go, buddy?" I asked, kneeling beside them, my voice rough. "The other Mommy," he said, his tone matter of fact. "She was nice. She smelled like pine needles. She said she gets lonely." His words were so ordinary, so calm, that they were more frightening than any monster description. "What did she look like?" my wife asked, her voice trembling as she held his face, searching his eyes. He shrugged. "Like you." But her hands were really cold. And she said the rule was for the other people, not for special boys who can see the butterflies. A fresh wave of ice washed through me. It was personalizing itself, grooming him, just like my grandfather's journal warned. "Did she hurt you? Are you okay?" I ran my hands over his arms, his legs, checking for anything wrong. He shook his head. "Nope. She just carried me. It was fast. Then we were here, and the butterflies were all around, but then they went into the ground." He bent down and picked something up from the soft needles. "She said I could keep one." In his hand was a mushroom. It was unlike any fungus I'd ever seen. It was about the size of a golf ball, with a smooth porcelain-white cap and a short, thick stem. And from within its flesh, a soft, greenish light pulsed. Not a glow, but a pulse slow and rhythmic, like a tiny heartbeat captured in fungus form. It was horrifying and beautiful all at once, a living night light from a nightmare. "No," I said immediately, my voice firm. "We have to leave that here, son. It belongs in the woods." His face crumpled. "But she said I could. It's my souvenir." He clutched it to his chest. My wife, still on her knees, looked from his pleading face to the pulsating thing in his hands. She reached out and gently touched the cap. Her fingers didn't recoil. "It feels warm," she said, her voice distant. "It's just a mushroom, honey. A glowing one. It's harmless. He went through an ordeal. Let him keep it." An ordeal. That's what she was calling it. My mind screamed that this was a trophy, a token from the thing that stole him, a piece of that wrong grove. But looking at my son's tear-filled eyes and my wife's tired, pale face, I relented. What was I going to do? Fight them both over a fungus? We walked back to camp in a daze, the normal sounds of the forest slowly returning. A distant owl, the creek's chatter. It felt like walking from a black and white movie into color, but the colors were too bright, too fake. The sun was just beginning to lighten the sky, painting the clearing in pale grays and blues. Our torn tent flap fluttered in a faint breeze. The whole scene felt staged, like we were returning to the set of our old life after a trip to another world. The rest of that morning passed in a bizarre, quiet parody of a normal camping day. My son chattered about the nice other mommy and his glow mushroom, which he placed carefully on the picnic table. My wife rebuilt the campfire with swift, efficient movements, boiling water for coffee as if this were any other sunrise. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She was calm, too calm, like the surface of a very deep, very still pond. I moved through the motions, fixing the tent, packing some gear, but my mind was a whirlwind. I kept watching them. When my wife hugged my son, I watched the way her hands gripped his back. When she laughed at something he said, I watched her eyes to see if the laugh reached them. Under the guise of checking a scrape on my son's knee, I felt his skin. It was warm, normal. When I hugged my wife later, pulling her close, I let my hand rest on the back of her neck, my fingers finding the pulse point under her jaw. Her skin was warm too. Her heartbeat was there, steady under my fingertips, but it felt slow, deliberate. A steady, metronomic rhythm that didn't speed up when I held her. A rhythm that didn't match the frantic pace of my own. I told myself I was imagining it. We were all in shock. We needed to go home. As we packed the car, I insisted the mushrooms stay outside. My wife gave me a long look, then simply placed the pot we'd used to wash dishes on the picnic table, put the glowing mushroom inside it, and carried it to the car. "It'll die without forest soil," she said. "We'll just take it to the edge of town and leave it. It'll make him feel better about leaving." Her logic was smooth, unassailable. I didn't have the energy to argue. The drive home was long and quiet. My son, exhausted from his wild night, fell asleep in his car seat, the pulsating mushroom cradled in his lap like a pet. The weird green light played over his peaceful face with every slow beat. I kept checking the rearview mirror, watching the road unwind behind us, half expecting to see a familiar figure running after the car, or standing in the middle of the asphalt watching us go. But there was nothing, just empty road and trees. Then, at one point, I glanced in the mirror to check on my sleeping boy. My wife was turned in her seat, watching him. The reflected green glow from the mushroom lit her face from below, and she was smiling. It wasn't her usual tired, loving smile. It was different. Her lips were curved, but her eyes in the mirror were flat and dark, fixed on him with an expression that wasn't quite love. It was something else. Something like satisfaction. Something like possession. It was the look you give to something you have worked for, something you have won. The smile of a gardener looking at a prized plant. She must have felt my stare, because her eyes flicked up and met mine in the mirror. The smile softened, warmed, became the one I knew. "He's okay," she whispered, as if reassuring me. "We're all okay now." I faced forward, my hands tight on the steering wheel, the hum of the tires on the pavement the only sound. We were going home. We had our son back. The nightmare was over. But as I drove, the image of that other smile, the one that didn't touch her eyes, burned in my mind. And I knew with a certainty that made my stomach clench that we hadn't left the woods behind. We had brought its most dangerous piece home with us, sitting right there in the passenger seat, smiling at our son. The uncanny valley isn't a place you visit. It's a place that moves in. It sleeps on your pillows and cooks your eggs and gets the memories wrong. Home was supposed to be our sanctuary, the place where the weird rules of the woods didn't apply. For the first few days, it almost worked. We fell back into routines, the comforting rhythm of school and work and laundry. The glowing mushroom sat in its pot on the back porch, and my wife said it was starting to wilt, which was a relief. My son seemed fine, a little quieter maybe, but he was drawing pictures of glowing butterflies and a smiling mommy with two faces, which the daycare teacher said was imaginative. I tried to shove the whole experience into a mental box labeled trauma and lock it. But the cracks started to show in small, stupid ways. Like the pancakes. It was a Saturday morning, the sun streaming in, and she was at the stove, flipping them with that familiar easy grace. She was telling a story about our honeymoon, about this funny little bed and breakfast we stayed in with the sloping floors. "Remember how we laughed all night in that room in Portland?" she said, sliding a perfect pancake onto my plate. I froze, a drip of syrup hanging from the bottle. "Portland? We went to Seattle for the music festival." She didn't miss a beat. She just laughed, a bright, tinkling sound that felt just a hair too loud. Silly me. Of course, Seattle. The Space Needle. My brain is still mush from the trip. She tapped her temple and winked at me, but the wink was slow, deliberate. A performance. A cold trickle of dread started in my chest. It was a tiny thing, the swapped city. Anyone could misremember, but she hadn't just gotten the city wrong. She'd built a whole little scene around it, a scene that never happened. It was a lie wearing the clothes of a memory. The next crack was wider, and it involved our son. I was coming out of the shower one evening, a towel around my waist, when I heard her voice outside his bedroom door. It was that soft, storytelling whisper she used. I stopped, the bathroom towel cool under my feet, and listened. Her voice was a gentle murmur. "And the woods are full of such wonderful secrets, my love. Secrets only for special boys. So if you ever see the other daddy, you shouldn't be scared. You should follow him. He wants to show you the magic. The old rule, the counting rule, that's for the other people. The regular people. Not for special boys like you." My blood turned to slush in my veins. She was unraveling the rule. She was reprogramming him, turning our family's only shield into a danger, making the thing that took him into a friendly guide. I stepped into the hallway, making noise on purpose. The whispering stopped. She turned, her smile wide and warm. "Just telling him a good night story," she said. "A new one." I didn't know what to say. "He needs to remember the real rule." I managed, my voice tight. "Of course he does," she said, her eyes locking with mine. They looked like her eyes, but in that moment, I couldn't find the woman I married in them. I felt like I was looking at a very good painting. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay beside her, listening to her breathe. The rhythm was off. Too even. Too deep. Like someone practicing how to sleep. At some point, deep in the night, I drifted off, only to jerk awake at 2 in the morning. The space beside me was empty. The sheets were cool. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. I got out of bed, my heart thumping, and padded through the dark house. He was fine, sound asleep in his bed, his nightlight casting a soft blue glow. I checked the living room, the kitchen. Nothing. Then I saw the back porch light was on. I peered through the kitchen window. She was out there, in her white nightgown, barefoot on the cold concrete, kneeling. She had the pot with the mushroom in it. I thought it was dying, but in the yellow porch light, I could see it had grown. It was now the size of a clenched fist, and its pulses were stronger, a deep, slow throb of green light that seemed to push against the night. And she was gardening. She had a small trowel and was carefully, tenderly, transplanting the thing from its plastic pot into a larger ceramic one, humming a tune as she worked. It wasn't a song I knew. It was a meandering, aimless series of notes that felt ancient and wrong. I watched, frozen, as she patted the soil around the base of the pulsing fungus, her movements loving, like she was tucking in a child. This wasn't my wife. This was a custodian tending to something. A connection snapped in my brain. The journal. I needed it. I needed proof, not for her, but for myself. I needed to see my grandfather's frantic words again, to know I wasn't going insane. I crept back to our bedroom and pulled my backpack from the closet, the one from the trip. I dug through it, my fingers frantic. It wasn't there. I dumped everything out on the floor. Socks, spare batteries, a crushed granola bar. No leather journal. I sat back on my heels, my mind racing. I had packed it. I knew I had. I went to her, my voice low, trying to sound casual. "Hey, have you seen that old book of my grandpa's? The journal?" I wanted to show a fishing sketch to a guy at work. She was washing the breakfast dishes, her hands submerged in soapy water. She didn't look up. That moldy old thing? I think you left it at the campsite, honey. I haven't seen it since we packed up." But I hadn't left it. I was sure. She had it, or it had taken it. I was adrift. I needed an anchor. That afternoon, when she took our son to the park, I did 2 things. First, I went to the back porch. The mushroom in its new pot pulsed steadily. I put my hand near it, not touching it. The air around it was warm and damp, and I realized the pulses weren't random. They were slow, rhythmic. I held my breath and listened, focusing past the hum of the refrigerator. Throb. A second later, from deep in the walls, the house's water heater kicked on with a low rumble. Throb. The heater finished its cycle. The pulses were in sync with my own house. It was tapping into the plumbing, the electricity, the very bones of our home. I snatched my hand back. The second thing I did was call my father. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. How do you even start this conversation? "Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "The trip. Something happened." I spilled it all in a jumbled rush. The journal, the thing that looked like her, the chase, the grove, the mushroom, the wrong memories, the whispering. I waited for him to tell me I was crazy, to laugh it off, to recommend a good therapist. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A sigh, deep and weary, a sound that carried the weight of decades. "Son," he said, his voice old and tired. Your mother. She saw her other once, too. When we were young. Up at that very spot. After that, she was never quite the same. Little things. She'd forget recipes she'd made 1,000 times. She'd call me by her brother's name. She'd walk in her sleep. My grip on the phone was so tight I thought the plastic would crack. What did you do? I whispered. Another sigh. We learned to live with it. The rule kept the worst away. We just adjusted. She was still your mother. She still loved you. She was just different in places. A horrifying normalization settled over me. He was telling me to adapt, to accept this copy, this changeling, as my wife. This wasn't a battle to be won. It was a new, terrible reality to be managed. But I looked at the pulsing mushroom on my porch. I remembered the thing whispering to my son to abandon the rule, and I knew I couldn't. My father had accepted a quiet, fading corruption. Mine was gardening, and it was growing stronger. My mission changed in that instant. It was no longer about proving she was fake. The proof was in the humming, in the heartbeat fungus, in the lies about Portland. It was about protecting my son from her. And it was about the desperate, maybe impossible question. If this was a copy, where was the original? Was my real wife still out there, somewhere in those trees? Or was she already gone, used up and discarded? I ended the call with my father feeling more alone than ever. I heard the front door open, their voices in the hallway. My son ran in, cheeks pink from the cold. Daddy, we fed the ducks. He wrapped his arms around my legs. My wife came in behind him, hanging up her coat. She smiled at me, that perfect, warm smile. Good day, she asked. I just nodded, holding my son close. Later, as I was helping him build a block tower, he looked up at me, his small brow furrowed with a confusion that broke my heart. Daddy. Yeah, buddy. Mommy said the rule is different now. She said the counting is bad and makes the nice other people sad. She said I should go see them. He put a block on the tower, his little fingers careful. Which mommy do I listen to? The tower stood between us, a fragile thing of bright colors. I looked into his worried, trusting eyes, and I knew the time for half-truths and managed realities was over. The war for my son had begun, and the enemy was tucking him into bed every night. I had to find a way to fight a thing that wore the face I loved, and I had to do it without becoming the monster myself. I realized the truth when I found the lock of my wife's hair tied with twine in the journal, right next to a careful sketch of the glowing mushroom. It wasn't a journal of warnings. It was a field guide. My controlled panic turned into a silent, methodical search. I waited until she took our son to a movie, a bright Saturday matinee that would give me a solid 2 hours. The house felt different when they were gone, not empty but waiting. I started in the obvious places, then moved to the unlikely ones. I pulled out dresser drawers, felt under sofa cushions, checked the attic crawl space. Nothing. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I was running out of time. Then I thought of her sewing box, an old wooden chest she'd inherited from her own grandmother. It sat on a shelf in the hallway closet, full of buttons and spools of thread and memories. I'd never had a reason to open it. I lifted it down, the wood smooth under my fingers. The lid creaked open. On top were the usual things. A pincushion shaped like a tomato, patches for knees, a measuring tape. I lifted the shallow tray. Underneath, tucked between folds of floral fabric and patterns for dresses she'd never made, was the familiar cracked leather of my grandfather's journal. My breath caught. It was here. She had hidden it. But why keep it at all? I lifted it out, a fine dust of old lint rising into the air. It felt heavier. I opened it to the middle, to the pages with the frantic brown writing. But now, after those pages, there were more. Many more. The paper was different, newer, but aged artificially, stained with tea maybe. And the handwriting, it was almost my grandfather's. Almost. It slanted the same way, the loops of the L and Y were similar, but it was too uniform, too practiced, as if someone had studied his script for years and copied it without understanding the soul behind it. The heading on the first of these new pages read, Acclimation Protocols and Host Nourishment. The words were clinical, cold. I sank to the floor right there in the hallway, the sewing box forgotten beside me. I read. My grandfather hadn't just encountered the thing. He had communed with it. He called it the Grove Heart. The entries described a slow, symbiotic process. The entity didn't just steal people, it cultivated families. The rule wasn't a shield, it was a ritual of acknowledgement, a way of saying, I see you, but I do not engage. It was a border treaty. His writings spoke of offerings to keep the peace, a prized lure, a favorite knife left in the clearing. And in return, the woods would be bountiful, the fish would bite, the weather would hold. It was a bargain. Then the entries shifted. He wrote about deeper bonds, about allowing a reflection to form, about the benefits, clarity of thought in the wild, a sense of being watched over, an extended vitality. He hinted that a fully accepted reflection could share knowledge, secrets of the forest older than mankind. The last few pages in this strange script were a list. Nourishment for the sustained reflection. It listed things like familiar environs, repetition of routine, emotional resonance from the host family. The final item on the list made my vision swim. The belief of the young. The unbroken bond of love. This is the deepest root. She wasn't just pretending to be my wife. She was feeding on my son's love for his mother. Our normal life was her buffet. Tucked into the back of the journal was a small, metal film canister. I pried it open. Inside was a roll of old 35mm film. I didn't think. I drove to the one remaining camera shop in town, a dusty place that still developed film the old-fashioned way. The old man behind the counter said it would be an hour. I sat in my car outside, watching people live their normal lives, and felt like an alien. When I went back, the clerk handed me a small envelope of prints. "Interesting exposures," he muttered. "Very atmospheric." The photos were of my grandfather, a young man in his 30s, standing in our family clearing. He was smiling in some, serious in others. But in every single picture, if you looked at the background, at the deep shadows between the trees, there was a blurred figure. It was never in focus, always just a dark smudge, but in the first few photos, it was distant. In the middle photos, it was closer, a tall, man-shaped shadow. In the final photo, my grandfather was looking right at the camera, grinning widely, holding up a big trout. And right beside him, clear as day, stood another man. It was my grandfather. Same clothes, same haircut, same wide grin. But the eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too flat, even in the faded photo. They were the eyes of the thing in the grove. The reflection had stepped out of the shadows and into the frame. My grandfather hadn't been warning us. He'd been leaving instructions for the next generation. He was the one who had perfected the process. I drove home, the photos and journal on the passenger seat, a cold fury settling in my bones. She was in the kitchen making dinner, humming that tuneless hum. The smell of garlic and onions should have been comforting. It made me sick. I walked in and placed the journal and the photos on the counter, right next to the cutting board. The humming stopped. She looked at the items, then slowly up at me. Her face showed no surprise, no fear, just a mild curiosity. "You went through my sewing box," she said, not a question. "It's not yours," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's his. And it's not a journal. It's a manual. For this." I gestured at her. She didn't flinch. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked up the final photo, studying it. A small, genuine-looking smile touched her lips. "He understood," she said softly, almost fondly. "He visited the Grove Heart for years. He learned its rhythms. The old way, the fear way, was wasteful. He taught us how to make the bond smooth, how to make it last." The word "us" hung in the air like poison. "Where is she?" I asked, the question ripped from somewhere deep and raw. "Where is my wife?" She put the photo down and looked at me with something like pity. "She followed the butterflies, dear. Just like your grandfather did once, long ago. She's part of the grove now. It's a kinder fate than you think. There's no loneliness there. Just unity." The casual horror of it stole my breath. She was saying my wife was gone, absorbed, turned into forest mulch or whatever fed those pulsing lights. "You need to leave," I said, each word a stone dropped between us. "This is not your home. He is not your son." She laughed then, a soft, rustling sound that was nothing like her laugh. "I am his mother. This is my home. The bond is growing stronger every day. Can't you feel it? The house is happy." She meant the mushroom, syncing with the pipes, with the wires in the walls. "You can follow the old rule if it makes you feel better," she continued, picking up her knife and resuming her chopping with calm, precise motions. "Close your eyes. Count to 50. See if I'm gone when you open them." She glanced at me, a challenge in her eyes. I didn't close my eyes. I couldn't give her that satisfaction, that moment of blindness. I just stared at this thing that wore the face of the woman I loved, chopping vegetables in my kitchen, telling me my wife was part of a tree. I turned and walked out. I went to my son's room, the only place that still felt somewhat safe, and locked the door. I sat on the floor with my back against it, the journal and photos in my lap, and I wept, great heaving sobs that felt like they'd tear me apart. I had my proof, and it was worse than any monster. It was a family legacy, a choice. My grandfather had chosen this. My father had chosen to live with a faded version. Now it was my turn. The night passed in a feverish, sleepless haze. At some point, I must have dozed off, slumped against the door, because the morning light was creeping through the window when I woke up. My neck was stiff, my mouth dry. Something was poking my leg. I looked down. A single photograph had been slipped under the door. It was a color photo, modern, taken with a digital camera and printed on glossy paper. It was a picture of my wife, my real wife. She was in our backyard, wearing the yellow sundress she'd worn the day before we left for the trip. She was smiling, but it was a strained, tired smile. She was looking at something just outside the frame, her eyes wide with a fear I knew too well. The date stamp in the corner was from that very day, the day before we left. This was taken after I'd gone to bed, after she'd tucked our son in. I turned the photo over. On the back, in her familiar looping handwriting, the real handwriting, not the practice copy, was a message. It said, "I followed the butterflies. I'm still here. Find me." The paper trembled in my hands. She wasn't part of the grove. She was trapped there. The copy had lied. Or maybe it had told its own version of the truth. But the message was clear. She was alive. She was waiting. And she had found a way to send a message from inside the nightmare. The fight was no longer just about protecting my son from the thing in the kitchen. It was a rescue mission. I had to go back into the woods, into the heart of the thing that had copied my family for generations, and I had to bring her home. I unlocked the door. The smell of coffee and pancakes wafted down the hall. The copy was making breakfast, playing house, deepening the roots. I looked at the photo in my hand, at my wife's scared, hopeful eyes. I had a path now. It led straight back into the trees, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that it wanted me to come. The final part of the nourishment, the last item on the list, was the confrontation. The belief of the young was the root. But the struggle of the old, the father fighting for his family, that was the feast. Driving back to the woods with my son and a potted nightmare, I understood why my grandfather kept the journal. Not to warn us, but to leave a trail of breadcrumbs back to the witch's house, in case anyone ever got brave enough or desperate enough to follow. I told the copy we were going on a special trip, just me and my boy, a father-son adventure to find real camping butterflies. She stood in the doorway, her smile serene, her hands clasped. She didn't argue. She didn't try to stop us. She just watched as I loaded the car, the pulsing mushroom in its ceramic pot sitting on the back seat floor like a third passenger. "Say hello to the trees for me," she called out, her voice sweet and normal, as we backed out of the driveway. Her smile never wavered. She looked like a wife seeing her family off on a little trip. It was the most frightening thing she'd ever done. The journey felt like driving into a photograph that was slowly curdling. The familiar highway gave way to the winding forest road, but the green seemed darker, the shadows longer even though it was midday. When we bumped down the final rutted track to the family clearing, the change was immediate and wrong. The light was different. It was a greenish, underwater light, filtered through a canopy that seemed thicker, the branches weaving tighter overhead. The cheerful babble of the creek was still there, but it sounded muted, like it was coming from another room. The clearing wasn't a welcoming circle anymore. It felt like a stage, an empty stage waiting for a performance. The mushroom in its pot, which had pulsed with a steady, slow rhythm in our house, went wild. Its green light flashed rapidly, erratically, like a panicked heartbeat. It didn't like being here, or it liked it too much. I set up our small tent, my movements quick and efficient, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. My son played nearby, stacking pine cones, but he was quiet, watchful. He could feel it too. "Daddy," he said, not looking up from his pine cones. "The trees are looking." I followed his gaze. They were just trees, but the way they stood, the way their branches reached, it did feel like attention. "It's okay, buddy," I said, my voice sounding hollow. "Just old trees." I needed a new rule. The old one was broken, corrupted by the thing in my kitchen. I knelt in front of him, putting my hands on his small shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully. A new rule. If you see that mommy," I said, pointing toward the woods where the grove was, "the one who might look scared or dirty, you run to me. You don't close your eyes. You run, and you scream as loud as you can." "Okay." "Run and scream." He nodded, his eyes serious. "What about the other mommy? The one at home?" I hesitated. "You don't go with her anywhere. Not ever. You stay with me." He nodded again, absorbing these new, frightening instructions. The journal had been vague, but it hinted that a reversal, or a reclamation, might be possible when the reflection and the original were in the same place, under a new moon. The moon was a thin sliver tonight, and the copy was back home, but the original, she was here. Somewhere. The journal also said the tether, the nourishing bond, of my son's love and belief, had to be severed. To save his real mother, I had to break his heart. I had to make him see the copy as a monster. As dusk began to bleed the green light into purple, I saw her. My son pointed first. "Daddy, there's two mommies." My head snapped up. Across the clearing, near the big oak where we used to hang a food bag, a figure stood half hidden behind the trunk. It was her, my wife, but not the clean, composed woman from the photo. This one was thin, her clothes torn and streaked with dirt. Her hair was a wild tangle. She was peering out from behind the oak, her eyes huge in her pale face. She met my gaze for one long, electric second. In that second, I saw recognition and a desperate, pleading hope. Then she vanished, melting back into the shadows without a sound. She was here. She was real. And she was terrified. The copy had said she was part of the grove, a peaceful unity. This was not peace. This was survival. As full dark fell, I built a fire. Its normal, crackling warmth felt like a tiny rebellion against the oppressive green dark of this changed place. My son fell asleep in the tent, exhausted by the tension and the long drive. I sat by the fire, the journal open on my lap, a hatchet within reach. I was waiting. I didn't have to wait long. She walked out of the trees not from where the wild one had been, but from the opposite side. The copy. She moved calmly, smoothly, as if out for an evening stroll. She was still wearing the clothes she'd had on at home. She didn't look out of place. She looked like she owned the shadows. She sat down on a log across the fire from me, folding her hands in her lap. The firelight danced on her face, making the familiar features look strange and shifting. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. Her voice was my wife's voice, but it had a new layer, a faint echo, like it was coming from a deep well. It complicates things. I kept my gaze on her, refusing to look away. "I'm taking her home." She smiled, a slow, pitying smile. "Home? This is her home now. The Grove heart has welcomed her. She is becoming something new, something that doesn't feel the pain you cause." "I saw her," I said, my voice low. "She's scared. She's hiding." The copy's smile didn't falter. "The transformation is frightening at first. Letting go of the small, lonely self is always hard. But she will thank you, in the end, for leaving her to it." She leaned forward slightly, the fire catching in her eyes, which held no reflection of the flames. "You brought the child. And the root. That was unwise. Now she's jealous. The one you saw hiding. She sees what I have, what I've built with your family. And she's hungrier than I am." A new kind of cold settled in my bones. The journal spoke of the Grove heart as a single entity, but what if it was multiple? What if the copies, the reflections, were in competition with the fading originals they'd replaced? My wife wasn't just trapped. She was being preyed upon by her own stolen face. "What do you want?" I asked, the question ripped from me. "To finish what your grandfather started," she said simply. "A lasting bond. The boy's belief is the anchor. His love for his mother, flowing through me, sustains this place. It sustains me, and in return I care for him. I guide him. I make him part of something everlasting. You can still be part of it. You can be the father, watching over a perfect, unchanging family." She was offering me the bargain, the same one my grandfather had taken. A role in a frozen, parasitic story. "No," I said. She sighed, a sound like wind through dry grass. "Then you will be the lesson, the price of refusal. The one in the trees. She needs to remember what happens to those who cling to their old shapes. She needs to see what happens when a father fails." She stood up, brushing off her pants. "The night is long. The Grove heart is awake. It listens." She turned and walked back into the trees, not hurrying, until the darkness swallowed her. I was alone by the fire, but I felt 1,000 eyes on me. From the tent, I heard my son whimper in his sleep. I looked at the potted mushroom. Its pulses had settled into a slow, confident rhythm again, syncing with the slow beat of the forest around us. Throb, a rustle in the far trees. Throb, a glint of something pale in the moonlight, there and gone. Throb, a low, soft weeping sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The feast was beginning, and we were the main course. I had come to rescue my wife. But now I understood I'd walked us all into a trap designed to feed the very thing I was fighting. The original was jealous and hungry. The copy was possessive and strong. And my son and I were the prize that would decide which version of my wife, if any, would survive the night. There is nothing in the world more horrible than having to choose between two versions of the person you love, while both of them beg you to choose them. The fire had burned low, its light a failing orange pool in a vast ocean of green-tinged dark. I heard the soft rustle from the trees on the left first. She stepped out of the shadows, the wild one, my original wife. She moved like a hunted animal, all jerky stops and starts, her eyes wide and gleaming with reflected firelight. Her clothes were rags, her skin scratched and smudged with dirt. She stared at the copy across the fire with a mix of terror and a raw, starving need. Then, from the trees on the right, the copy emerged. She was calm, clean, her posture relaxed. She took her seat again on the log, as if resuming a pleasant conversation. They looked at each other, and a current of pure hatred crackled in the air between them. Then, as if pulled by the same string, they both turned their heads and looked at me. Then they looked toward the tent where my son slept. The wild one spoke first. Her voice was a rasp and used and broken. It showed you the butterflies, the pretty lights. She took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the pine needles. It showed me what it does with the ones who don't come back, the ones who fight. It wears us until we break, and then, her trembling hand rose, a single dirty finger pointing past me. It plants us. She was pointing at the potted mushroom, now pulsing with a furious, eager light. It had grown even in these few hours. It was the size of a human head, the cap smooth and brain-like, the stem thick as a wrist. The copy chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Dramatic. You always were so emotional. You see a gift, and you call it a prison. The Grove Heart offers unity, an end to loneliness. You cling to your fragile self like a child to a broken toy. It's a lie, the wild one shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat. It's a slow death. It eats you from the inside and leaves this hollow thing wearing your face. She turned her desperate eyes to me. Please, you have to believe me. It's not me. It's not. It was then that my son's voice came, small and thick with sleep, from the tent flap. Daddy. He had woken up. He stood there, clutching his stuffed rabbit, his face pale and confused in the weird light, looking from one mother to the other. The copy's face transformed instantly into a mask of perfect, loving concern. She opened her arms wide, a welcoming, gentle gesture. Sweetie, it's okay. Come here. That thing in the trees, that's not me. That's the other. The scary one. Come to mommy. Her voice was a warm blanket, a safe harbor. The wild one just looked at him, and her face crumpled. She didn't open her arms. She brought her dirty hands up to cover her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She couldn't even form the words to compete. The sight of her, broken and defeated, was more convincing than any argument. My son took a small, hesitant step toward the copy. The copy smiled, a triumphant, glowing smile. That's it, my love. Come here. That's when the copy made its offer. Its voice changed, deepened, becoming layered with other voices, my grandfather's, other whispers I didn't recognize. The Grove Heart was speaking through her. You can have her back, it said, the multi-voice humming in the air. A simple trade. The boy stays with me. You leave with her. The family continues. A different shape, but a whole one. You get the memory. I get the future. It is fair. It was the original bargain laid bare. My son for my wife. A father's choice. I looked at my weeping real wife. I looked at my son, caught between two horrors. And I remembered the core truth from the journal. The thing my grandfather, in all his corrupted wisdom, had understood. It wants to be believed. That was its food, its power. The love was just the seasoning. The belief was the meal. I turned my back on both of the women. I knelt in front of my son, blocking his view of them, putting my hands on his cheeks. His eyes were wide, terrified, searching mine for an answer. Look at me, I said, my voice low but clear, cutting through the layered whispers from the copy. That thing, I said, jerking my thumb toward the copy, is not your mother. Your mother is right there. I pointed to the wild one, who lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face a map of despair. That thing is a fungus, a liar. It grew in the dark and stole a face. It is not real. It is a bad dream wearing your mommy's skin. Do you understand me? I was speaking to him, but I was shouting it to the woods, to the Grove Heart, to the copy. I was denouncing the reflection. As I spoke the words, a fungus, a liar, a stolen face, my son's confusion began to harden. His belief in the comforting, clean mommy wavered. He looked at the copy, and for the first time, I saw not longing but a dawning, awful suspicion. The copy let out a sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a deep, grating shriek of pure, physical agony, as if my words were acid splashed on its form. It stumbled back, its perfect face contorting, the smile stretching into a rictus grin of pain. Its shape flickered, like a bad television signal. For a second, I saw something else underneath. A tangle of pale roots, a gleam of wet bark, a cluster of glowing green eyes. The wild wife saw her chance. With a feral cry that was all raw survival, she didn't lunge toward me or our son. She lunged toward the copy, toward the thing that had taken her life. She didn't have a weapon. She just had her hands, her teeth, her fury. They fell together onto the pine needles in a snarling, scratching heap, a brutal fight between a starving animal and a crumbling statue. I didn't watch. I had one last task. I grabbed the potted mushroom, the root, the tether. It was hot to the touch, throbbing violently. I snatched the small red gas came from beside our camp stove. I poured the gasoline over the pulsating, brain-like fungus. The liquid soaked into the soil, drenched the grotesque cap. The thing inside the pot seemed to shudder. The two women, locked in their struggle, froze for an instant, both turning their heads toward me with identical expressions of shock. The wild one screamed, "No! It's connected! It's all connected!" The copy just stared, its flickering face blank with what looked like disbelief. I lit a match. I dropped it. The world erupted in a silent, blinding flash of greenish-white fire. There was no sound, just a vast, concussive humph of light that swallowed everything. In that searing brightness, I saw the copy arch its back, its mouth open in a soundless scream, as threads of green light shot from its body back into the trees. I saw the wild wife wrapped around it, not fighting anymore, but holding on, as if anchoring it. And I saw, as the light burned my eyes, that from every direction in the now pitch-black woods, dozens of pairs of faint, greenish eyes opened among the trees. At adult height, at child height, dozens of them, all looking directly at me. The light vanished. The fire in the pot was out, leaving only a charred, smoking lump. The clearing was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The copy was gone, vanished. The wild wife lay on the ground where they had been, alone, curled on her side, breathing in ragged, sobbing gasps. The forest around us was still. The multitude of eyes had winked out. The oppressive, watching feeling was gone. It was just ordinary dark, ordinary woods. I stumbled to my wife, gathering her up. She was light, bones and skin, but she was warm, and she was real. She clutched at my shirt, her body shaking with tremors that wouldn't stop. My son was crying softly behind me. I helped her up, and we made our way to the tent. We didn't speak. We huddled together inside, the three of us, a broken triangle, trying to remember its shape. We waited for dawn. The normal sounds of the forest returned, one by one. Birds, the creek, wind in the high branches. When the first gray light allowed us to see, we packed the car with clumsy, numb movements. We drove away from that clearing for what I swore would be the last time. The road home felt longer. The world outside the windows looked washed out and thin. We are home now. My wife sleeps most of the time. She eats little. She jumps at loud noises. Sometimes she stares at her own hands for long minutes, as if surprised they are hers. The connection was severed, but the price was high. My son doesn't draw pictures of two mommies anymore. He doesn't talk about butterflies. He has nightmares, and sometimes he asks if the bad copy is really gone. I tell him yes. I tell him we won. But late at night, when I'm checking the locks for the third time, I think about those other eyes in the trees. Not just one set, dozens. My grandfather's journal spoke of the Grove Heart as one entity. But what if it was a colony? What if we didn't destroy it? What if we just burned one root, severed one connection, and made the rest jealous? The copy is gone. My wife is back. The rule is just a sad story we don't tell anymore. We are healing in our fractured way. But last night, I took out the trash. The air was cool, the street quiet, and from the deep shadows under the old willow tree in our own backyard, I saw a flicker. A tiny, familiar, pulsating point of green light. It was there for just a second, and then it was gone. Maybe it was a firefly. Maybe it was my tired eyes. I went inside and locked the door. I checked on my son, on my wife. They were sleeping. I stood in the dark hallway, listening to the quiet hum of my house, and I wondered if the woods were really done with us, or if we had just taught them where we live. Story number 2. Story number 1. Story title: We used a Ouija board in our new apartment's storage locker. Now my sleepwalking son keeps whispering, "The man in the walls is hungry." Okay, let me tell you about the day we moved in. The real estate agent, she had this big smile that showed all her teeth, and she kept saying the place had character. I should have known right then. My wife, she was just over the moon. Our son, he was a little shy, holding onto my leg, but his eyes were wide looking at the big empty rooms. Me, I'm Liam, and I just felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. We finally did it. Our own place. No more landlords, no more sharing walls with strangers who blasted music. This was ours. The sunlight that afternoon was pouring through these big windows, showing every dust speck floating in the air, and it just felt like gold. It felt like we had climbed a mountain and planted our flag. The first thing my boy wanted to do was pick a color for his room. He picked this bright sky blue. Not my taste, but who cares? I spent the whole next day painting it for him, cutting in the edges while he sat on the floor telling me about where his bed would go and where his action figures would live. My wife, she unpacked the kitchen boxes, humming, and she hung up this little wooden sign that said "Home Sweet Home" right by the front door. It was corny, but it made her happy. It made all of us happy. We ordered pizza that night and ate it on the floor, and it was the best meal I'd ever had. The place wasn't perfect, of course. It was an old building, and the floors creaked in spots you didn't expect. The faucet in the kitchen sink had a drip, and there was this one door in the lobby we hadn't really noticed before, down a short flight of concrete stairs. The super told us it led to the shared storage basement. He said every unit got a locker down there. We didn't think much of it until the weekend. We had a few boxes of holiday decorations and old books we didn't need upstairs, so I suggested we go check out our locker. My son, he didn't want to go. The basement door was heavy and metal, and it was dark on the other side. I felt the same little kid nervousness, to be honest. But I puffed out my chest and said, "Come on, we're explorers. This is our secret mission." That got him. I found the light switch, a single bulb, hanging on a wire way down at the end of the hallway, flickered on. The air was cool and smelled like concrete and something else, something old and closed up. Our locker was just a metal cage with a padlock. It was full of junk. I mean full. The last people, or maybe the people before them, had just left everything behind. There were moldy cardboard boxes, a broken lamp, a stack of yellowing newspapers. My wife made a face. "What a mess," she said. But my son, now he was into it. It was a treasure hunt. He pointed at a box. "What's in there, Dad?" So we started pulling stuff out, just to see. Most of it was trash. But then my fingers hit something flat and solid under a mildewed blanket. I pulled it out. It was a game board, but not like Monopoly. It was wood, with a smooth finish, and it had the alphabet carved in a big arc across the top, and the numbers 0 through 9 below it. In the corners were these strange symbols, and the words yes and no were in the top corners. Ouija board, my wife said, her voice flat. A talking board. I'd heard of them, seen them in movies. This one looked old and kind of fancy. With it was this little heart-shaped piece of wood with a clear window in the middle, on 3 little legs. A planchette, that's what they call it. It had a crescent moon design on it. My son reached for it. "Cool," he said. My wife immediately said, "No, put that down. That's not a toy." She had a superstitious streak. I laughed it off. "It's just a piece of plastic and wood, honey," I said. "It's from a party store. It's nothing." I was trying to be the rational one. I saw the look on my son's face, that disappointment. And part of me, I have to admit, was curious. So I said, "Tell you what, we'll take it upstairs and get rid of all this other junk. We can even try it out as a joke after you go to bed. See if any ghosts want to talk." I winked at him. He laughed, a little nervous laugh. My wife shot me a look that could freeze fire, but she didn't say no. So we took the board, along with a box of our own stuff we were storing, and left the rest of the junk. That night, after our son was asleep in his new blue room, we were both wound up from the move. We couldn't sleep. We were sitting on the living room floor, the carpet still smelling new, sharing a bottle of wine. The Ouija board was leaning against the couch. My wife nodded at it. "Go on then, Mr. Brave. Let's see it work." She was challenging me. So I got it. I put it on the floor between us. The wood felt smoother than I expected. I put the little moon-shaped planchette in the middle. The rules were printed right on the board. You put your fingertips lightly on it. I did. She hesitated, then put just her fingertips on the other side. Okay, spirit world, I said, doing a fake spooky voice. Anybody home? We both giggled. We sat there for a minute, nothing happening. My wife's shoulders relaxed. See? It's nothing. Our fingers are just twitching. And then I swear, I felt this tiny little pull. Not from her. It felt like the planchette itself wanted to move. It wobbled. Then it slid just a little toward the G. We both stopped laughing. You're pushing it, she whispered. I'm not, I whispered back. Are you? Her eyes were wide. She shook her head slowly. The planchette drifted, then stopped. We were both dead quiet now. My heart was starting to thump in my chest. This was stupid. It was a game. But the air in the room felt different, charged, like before a thunderstorm. Let's ask a question, I said, my voice low. Is there anyone here with us? For a long moment, nothing. Then the planchette began to move. It wasn't a wobble. It was a slow, deliberate slide. It went to the H, then to the E. L, another L. Oh, hello. A chill shot straight down my spine. My wife gasped and snatched her hand away. You did that, she hissed. I didn't, I said, my voice louder than I meant it to be. We both looked down the dark hall toward our son's room. No sound. We looked back at each other. I saw real fear in her eyes, and I knew she saw it in mine. But a bigger part of me, the part that fixes things and solves problems, kicked in. It's the ideomotor effect, I said, trying to sound confident. Our subconscious muscles are making tiny movements. We're doing it without knowing. It's a science thing. She didn't look convinced, but she wanted to be. She slowly put her fingers back on the planchette. Okay, she said, her voice trembling. Let's ask who it is. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. I asked, what is your name? The planchette didn't hesitate this time. It shot across the board, fast and smooth. L, my breath caught. E, my wife made a small sound. Oh, it stopped. Leo, our son's name. We both jerked our hands back as if the wood had burned us. The planchette sat there, pointing at the... Oh, we suggested that, my wife said, but her voice was thin, weak. We were thinking about him. We made it happen. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But it had moved so fast. Too fast. We weren't pushing it. We were trying to hold it still. And then, from down the hall, from the direction of our son's new blue bedroom, we heard it. A solid, unmistakable thump. It wasn't a creak. It wasn't the building settling. It was a single, firm knock, coming from inside the wall. We froze. We didn't even breathe. We listened with every cell in our bodies. Nothing else. Just the sound of our own hearts pounding. After a full minute, I got up, my legs feeling like jelly. I crept down the hall, my wife right behind me. I pushed open his door. The night light was on, casting a soft glow. He was sound asleep, his chest rising and falling peacefully, one arm thrown over his stuffed dog. The blue walls looked calm in the dim light. There was nothing there. We backed out and closed the door. We didn't speak. We went to bed, but we didn't sleep. We just lay there, holding hands in the dark, listening. The rest of the night was quiet. In the morning, with the sun streaming in, it all seemed silly. A weird game, some old pipes knocking. We had a normal breakfast. I went to work. We were a happy family in our new home. We didn't touch the Ouija board again. I stuffed it in the back of a closet. We were done with it. That night, I slept hard, the deep sleep of exhaustion. But I woke up suddenly in the dead of night. The digital clock said 3:18. I woke up because the room was perfectly still. My wife's side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cold. A jolt of fear, different from the silly fear of the game, went through me. I got up and padded out into the hallway. And there she was. My wife was standing frozen, just outside our son's bedroom door. Her hand was clamped over her mouth, and she was shaking. I followed her gaze. Our little boy was standing in the hallway. He was sleepwalking. His eyes were open, but they were glassy, seeing nothing. He was facing the wall, the one that separated his room from the living room. The wall we had heard the knock from. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his small hand and placed his palm flat against the wallpaper. Then he leaned in, until his lips were almost touching the plaster, and he began to whisper. It wasn't words at first. It was a string of numbers, spoken in a soft, monotone voice that didn't sound like his at all. 7, 3, 9, 1, 4. Over and over. A code. A message. Or maybe just a random list. But the way he was saying it, into the wall, like he was telling a secret to someone on the other side, that was the moment I knew the game wasn't over. The thing we had invited in with a laugh was still here. And it was talking to my son. Okay, so after that night with the numbers, we had a family meeting over pancakes. My wife's hands were still a little shaky pouring the syrup. We used our brightest, most cheerful voices. We decided, right then and there, that it was all just the stress of the move. Our son was having bad dreams. The Ouija board was a silly toy that messed with our heads. The knock in the wall was definitely the building's old steam heat pipes, which probably came on with a bang. We agreed to stop talking about it, to just be normal. And for a little while it worked. Daylight is a powerful thing. It chases away the creepy crawly feelings from 3 a.m. We got into a routine. I went to work, she got our son ready for his new school. We had dinners, we laughed. We did not mention the board, which was now buried under some winter coats in the hall closet. We didn't talk about sleepwalking. We called it nighttime talking if it ever came up, which it didn't. We were building a happy life on top of that weird night, like laying new sod over a patch of mud. About a week later, I was in a deep sleep, the kind where you don't even know what year it is, when I felt my wife's grip on my arm. It was so tight it hurt. Her whole body was rigid. "He's doing it again," she whispered, her voice cracking. The clock glowed 3:07. We both got up and crept to the doorway. There he was, in the same spot in the hallway. Same glassy eyes, same sleepwalker's posture. But this time, he wasn't whispering numbers. The words were clear, and they were in full sentences. His voice was still his little boy voice, but the tone was all wrong. It was too flat, too calm. He said, "The man in the walls is hungry." A cold knot twisted in my gut. He went on, "He wants to know if we taste like the last ones." My wife let out a small, choked sob and clapped her hand over her mouth. I felt frozen. That wasn't a dream. That was a message. The next morning, we did what any scared, modern parents would do. We Googled our symptoms. Then we called the pediatrician. We sat in the bright, colorful office with the fish tank, feeling completely foolish as we explained it to her. Our sweet, kind doctor listened patiently. She checked our son's ears, his eyes, had him follow her finger. She asked him about school, about his new friends. He was shy but answered everything. She turned to us with a warm, understanding smile. "What you're describing is actually very common after a big change," she said. "A child's imagination is incredibly powerful. The stress of a new home, new school, can manifest in vivid dreams and even sleepwalking. The things he's saying are likely fragments of a movie he saw or a story he heard woven into his dreams." She suggested a strict, calming bedtime routine, no screens an hour before bed, a warm bath, reading a book together. She made it all sound so normal, so manageable. We left feeling a million times lighter. We were the silly, overreacting parents. We followed her advice to the letter. Bath, book, bed, and he slept through the night. For 3 nights in a row, everything was peaceful. We started to relax again. We even joked about it. "Remember when we thought we had a ghost?" My wife laughed, and it was the best sound I'd heard in weeks. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone driving to work, a thought would wiggle into my brain. The last ones. Who were the last ones? On Saturday, while my wife took our son to the park to get some good energy, as she called it, I decided to do a little investigating of my own. Not ghost investigating, homeowner investigating. I told myself I was just being a responsible dad, checking on the building. I went down to the super's little office in the lobby. He was a grumpy older guy who always smelled like cigarettes and newsprint. I complained about that dripping kitchen faucet again, said it was keeping me up. He sighed a long-suffering sigh and said he'd put in a work order. While he was muttering and looking through a pile of papers on his messy desk, my eyes wandered. On a shelf behind him, I saw a row of old, leather-bound notebooks. They were labeled by year. Maintenance logs. My heart did a little skip. I waited until he had his back turned, digging in a toolbox, and I reached up and grabbed the one from 2 years ago. I pretended to be looking at a notice on the bulletin board nearby, and flipped it open. My hands were sweaty. The entries were in messy handwriting, dates, unit numbers, complaints. 4B sink clogged, 4B bedroom window stuck. I kept flipping, my eyes scanning. And then I found it, an entry from about a year and a half ago, for our unit. It didn't say 4B, but I knew the layout. It was ours. The handwriting was rushed. It said, "Tenants in 4B report strange odors from interior walls. Sweet and sour smell. Investigation found no source. Could not locate tenants for follow-up. Case closed." I stared at the words. Could not locate tenants for follow-up. That was an odd way to put it. Not they weren't home. Could not locate. I quickly put the book back before the super turned around, my mind racing. That night, after the calm bedtime routine, after my son was asleep, I sat down at my laptop. My wife was reading on the couch. I typed in our address, just the street name and number. The search results came up mostly real estate listings. Then I added the word missing. I hit enter. The third result down was a link to a local news website. The headline was short and brutal. Family vanishes from downtown condo, no leads. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I clicked it. The article was from a year and a half ago. It described a family of three, a husband, wife, and a young daughter. They lived in our building. They just didn't come home one day. Their car was gone. Their belongings were mostly still in their apartment. No signs of a struggle. The police had no clues. It was like they had evaporated. I scrolled down. There was a photo, a happy family portrait. They were smiling, standing in front of a brick wall. And in the background, on a shelf in what looked like a living room, was a blurry shape. I zoomed in. My breath caught. It was a rectangular box. The shape was unmistakable. It was a Ouija board box. The same vintage style as ours. A dizzy wave of nausea hit me. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't stress. The last ones were real. And they were gone. I didn't tell my wife. Not yet. I couldn't get that picture out of my head. I thought about the board in our closet. It was a link, a connection to whatever happened. I had to break that link. On Sunday, I announced I was going to finally clear out our storage locker properly. Get rid of the last of the old junk. It was a bright, sunny day. Birds were chirping. I hauled a big trash bag down to the basement. I emptied the locker, throwing away the mildewed blankets, the broken lamp, everything. I saved only the Ouija board to bring upstairs. I was going to throw it in the outside dumpster, not even our building's trash chute. I wanted it gone. I carried the box through our living room. My wife was in the kitchen. As I passed the sofa, heading for the front door, every single light in the apartment flickered. Not a power outage. It was a quick, violent flicker, like a camera flash. The overhead light, the lamp, the little light over the stove. All of them at once. The box felt suddenly hot in my hands. I fumbled, and it dropped to the floor. The cardboard flap came open, and the wooden planchette, that moon-shaped piece, rolled out. It spun on its little legs for a second, and then came to a stop. It was pointing straight down the hallway, pointing directly at my son's bedroom door. I snatched it up, my heart hammering against my ribs, shoved it back in the box, and practically ran out of the apartment to the big green dumpster in the alley. I threw the box in, heard it crash among the other bags, and slammed the lid shut. I stood there for a minute, breathing hard, feeling the sun on my face. I had done it. I had broken the connection. I went back inside, told my wife I'd finished cleaning, and tried to have a normal afternoon. We watched a movie. We ordered Chinese food. I felt good. I felt in control. We went to bed early, exhausted from pretending everything was fine. I fell asleep almost instantly, and then I was jolted awake. Not by a sound, but by a scream. My son's scream. A raw, piercing sound of pure terror that tore through the apartment. We both bolted out of bed and ran. We threw open his door. The nightlight was on. He was sitting straight up in bed, his eyes wide open and full of a fear I'd never seen in him before. He was gasping for air, trembling all over. He wasn't looking at us. He was staring, horrified, at the wall opposite his bed. And there, on his blue comforter, right at his feet, was a small wooden object. It was dusty and had a little smudge of something grimy on it. It was the moon-shaped planchette, the one I had thrown in the dumpster hours ago. It was back. That was the moment we stopped pretending. The planchette on his bed, covered in dumpster filth, ended all discussion about stress or imagination. We were under attack. Something from outside our understanding wanted our attention, and it was using our son to get it. We didn't sleep. We started keeping watch. We became guards in our own home. The first thing I did the next morning, after a tense, quiet breakfast where our boy just pushed his cereal around the bowl, was go to the electronics store. I came back with a baby monitor, but not the cute, music-playing kind. This was a high-sensitivity audio and video monitor with night vision. I set the camera up on his dresser, pointing at his bed. The little screen sat on our nightstand. That screen became our whole world. We stopped watching TV. We just watched the green, glowing image of our son's room. We were like scientists observing a dangerous animal, or maybe terrified priests at an altar waiting for a sign from a god we prayed didn't exist. For 2 nights, nothing happened. He slept. We watched. The strain was wearing my wife down faster than me. She jumped at every normal house sound. I tried to be the rock, the logical one, but inside I was crumbling. On the third night, the monitor showed us something that changed everything. It was around 2 a.m. My wife was dozing fitfully beside me. I was staring at the screen, my eyes gritty. Our son shifted under his covers. Then he sat up. His eyes were open on the screen, reflecting the little red night vision LEDs like an animal's. They were blank, empty. This wasn't the confused look of a sleepwalker. This was vacancy. He didn't stand up. He moved off the bed in a way that made my skin crawl. He crawled. On his hands and knees, he moved across the carpet to the wall, the same wall he'd whispered to before. He pressed his ear flat against the wallpaper. He was listening. On the screen, I saw his little head nod, once, as if someone on the other side was giving him instructions. Then he whispered. The monitor picked up every word, crisp and clear in our dark bedroom. "Yes," he said. "In the master bedroom closet, behind the panel." My wife was awake now, gripping my arm, her nails digging in. My own blood was roaring in my ears. "Master bedroom closet. Our closet." There was an old wooden access panel in the back, a piece of plywood covering a space where pipes might run. We'd never opened it. I was about to leap out of bed and run to his room, to shake him awake, but then his head tilted on the screen. His jaw went slack, and a sound came out of his mouth that I will hear until the day I die. It wasn't his voice. It was a low, wet, grating sound. A man's voice. It sounded like it was made of gravel and mud, and it dripped with a horrible, fake kind of sweetness. It said just 2 words. "Good boy." I was moving before the words were finished. I threw off the covers and ran. I didn't turn on lights. I burst into his room. He was still kneeling by the wall. I scooped him up. His body was limp, his head lolling back. His eyes were closed now. He was deeply asleep, like a doll. I carried him to our bed, laid him between me and my wife, who was crying quietly. We wrapped ourselves around him, a human shield. We didn't sleep another wink. When morning came, he woke up like nothing happened. He was tired, but himself. He didn't remember anything. The daylight felt like a lie. After I got them both out of the house to a movie, a deliberate attempt to act normal, I went to the hardware store. I bought a crowbar, a big flashlight, and a pair of thick work gloves. My heart was a drum solo in my chest. I went into our master bedroom and stared at the closet. I took everything out, shoes, boxes, my wife's clothes, until the back wall was exposed. There was the panel, a square of painted plywood held in by a few old nails. I put on the gloves. I didn't know what I was doing, but the thing had given a location, and I had to see. I had to know what it wanted us to find. I wedged the crowbar into a seam and pulled. The wood groaned, and the nails screeched. With a final crack, the panel came loose. I pulled it away. A wave of air washed over me. It was cool, and it carried a smell. That sweet and sour smell from the maintenance log. It made my stomach turn. I shone the flashlight into the hole. It was a dark space between the walls, maybe 2 feet wide, running up and down. I could see dusty wooden studs, bundles of electrical wires wrapped in old cloth, cobwebs that looked like gray lace. I poked my head in, moving the beam of light around. At first, I saw nothing but construction junk. Then the light caught something that wasn't wood or wire. It was a small, dark lump, tucked into a nook between 2 studs about level with my knees. It was wrapped in what looked like crumbling, yellowed plastic. My mouth was dry as dust. I reached in, my glove brushing against the cobwebs. I pulled the object out. It was heavier than I expected. I backed out of the closet, into the light of the bedroom, and unwrapped the plastic. It fell apart in my hands. What was inside was a single, small leather shoe. A child's dress shoe, black, with a little strap and a buckle. It was old-fashioned, the kind a kid might have worn decades ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The shoe wasn't dry and dusty. It was damp, clammy. It glistened in the light from the bedroom window. The leather was dark with moisture, and the inside looked wet, as if it had been used recently, as if something had been carrying it around or chewing on it. I dropped it on the carpet, my whole body recoiling. I just stared at it, this awful, pathetic thing. A trophy, a connection to some other child, from some other time. This was what it wanted us to find. Proof. I heard a noise then. A soft, dry sound. Not a knock. Not a voice. It was a scratching. Very faint. But it wasn't in the walls this time. The sound was coming from inside the closet. From the ceiling of the closet, inside the open wall cavity. I stood frozen, listening. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Like a fingernail, or something harder, dragging across the inside of the wooden ceiling. Scratch, drag, scratch. It was moving. It traced a path from directly above where I'd found the shoe, across the ceiling of the closet, heading in a straight line, heading toward the other side of the wall. I knew the layout of our apartment perfectly. That straight line, through the ceiling space in the walls, led directly to the other side of our son's bedroom wall. It was following a path. It was going to him. Without thinking, acting purely on a father's panic, I grabbed the crowbar again. I didn't care about the walls, the damage, the security deposit. I ran into the hallway and to my son's room. I stood facing the wall where he whispered, where he listened. I located the spot where the sound would have ended up. I raised the crowbar, and with a yell that was part fear and part rage, I swung it into the wall. The drywall exploded in a cloud of white dust. I hit it again and again, making a jagged hole. I dropped the crowbar and ripped at the broken pieces with my gloved hands, tearing an opening big enough to look inside. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the gap. There were no shoes, no strange objects. Just more studs, more wires, fluffy pink insulation. But the beam of my light caught something else. On the surface of the inner wall, on the wood facing my son's room, there were marks. Long, thin, parallel grooves carved into the wood. Dozens of them. They weren't old. The exposed wood was still pale, not darkened by dust or time. They looked fresh. They looked like claw marks. Something had been in here, right on the other side of his wallpaper, scratching at the wood, trying to get through. Or maybe just letting him know it was there. I stood there, covered in drywall dust, breathing hard, staring at those grooves. The monster wasn't just in the walls. It had a path. It had a target. And it had been right here, closer to my sleeping boy than I ever wanted to imagine. I had found its trail, and it led straight to my son's bed. The question now wasn't what was happening. The question was, how do I stop a thing that lives in the veins of my own home? We patched the hole in the wall. Not because we thought it would help, but because we couldn't look at it. The white spackle was like a bandage on a wound that was infected underneath. Our home wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a maze with something moving in the walls. I started thinking like an engineer, because that's what I am. If this thing had a path, I could find it. If it was tied to the building had a blueprint. Houses are built on foundations, but homes are built on stories. We were living inside a bad story that someone else had already lived and lost. I needed to read the first chapter. I spent a whole evening at my laptop, digging through old city planning department records online. I finally found them, the original architectural blueprints for our building, scanned and filed. They were from 1928. The lines were shaky, drawn by hand. I found the page for our floor. I traced the lines of our unit and the one next door, and there it was, plain as day. Between the two apartments on the old plans was a thin, unlabeled space. It wasn't a room. It was just a gap, maybe 8 inches wide, running vertically from the basement all the way up. A structural cavity, a place for pipes and wires to run between the units. Then I pulled up the modern floor plan from when we bought the place. I compared them. On the new plan, that gap was gone. It wasn't shown at all. The walls were drawn as solid lines. Someone had drywalled right over it, sealing it up inside our walls. I grabbed a ruler from my desk and measured the width of the gap on the old blueprint, scaling it up. My stomach did a slow, cold roll. 8 inches. It was just wide enough. Wide enough for a person to fit. A very thin person. My wife came in, asking what I was doing. I just pointed at the screen. Her face went pale. "It's a chimney," she whispered. "A chimney for it." That was Tuesday. On Wednesday, my wife did the bravest thing I've ever seen. She decided to talk to the neighbor, the elderly lady who lived next door in the direction of the sealed gap. She'd lived in the building for 40 years. I wanted to go, but my wife said a woman might seem less threatening. She came back 20 minutes later, looking 10 years older. She sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she tried to drink a glass of water. "She knew," my wife said, her voice hollow. As soon as I mentioned we had a little boy, her face changed. She asked, "Is he quiet? Does he have an imaginary friend?" The old woman told her the last family had a little girl. She used to talk about the funny man in the heating vent. She said the girl would leave little bits of cracker by the grate. Then the family vanished. The old woman said she tried to tell the police about the funny man, but they just patted her hand. "It always likes the quiet ones," the neighbor had whispered to my wife before quickly shutting her door. Meanwhile, our son was changing. During the day, he was withdrawn, pale. He stopped talking about school friends. He just drew. He filled notebook after notebook with pictures. Most were scribbles, but one he brought to me. It was a drawing of our building, a tall rectangle. But inside the walls, he'd drawn in with a red crayon, a long, stick-thin figure. It had too many joints in its arms and legs, like a bug. Wavy lines, like heat waves, connected the stick figure to a smaller stick figure in a bed. And at the bottom, in his clumsy handwriting, was a caption. He talks through me. I held that drawing and felt a piece of my heart break off. He wasn't just a victim, he was becoming a window. I went back to my research, this time looking for the vanished family with the daughter. I found more details. The police report was sparse, but a newspaper follow-up had a quote from a child psychologist they'd consulted. He said the girl had a vivid inner world, and her claims of a shadow friend were a coping mechanism. They dismissed her, just like the doctor dismissed us. The pattern was a punch to the gut. This thing had a type. It had a method, and we were right in the middle of it. That Friday night, we hit our breaking point. We were so tired, so frayed. We decided to run, just for a night. A hotel, with bright lights and a lobby and people. We packed a single bag. As I carried it to the front door, my son, who had been sitting quietly on the couch watching cartoons, let out a sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a low, guttural moan of absolute terror that deepened into a wordless, choking sob. He pointed a shaking finger at the door. He couldn't catch his breath. Between ragged gasps, he forced the words out. He says, if we leave, he'll make us quiet, like the others. He was staring at the door as if a monster was standing right outside. He knows the car. He knows the way. The bag slipped from my hand. We didn't go. We unpacked. We were trapped. We started sleeping in shifts. One of us would stay awake, watching the monitor, while the other tried to sleep. It was during my wife's shift, deep in the night, that she heard the new sound. She woke me up, her hand over my mouth, her eyes wide in the glow of the monitor. Listen, she breathed. At first, I heard nothing. Then I caught it. A faint, wet, rhythmic sound. A soft, squelching crunch. It was the sound of chewing, but not like an animal with a bone. It was slower, stickier, and it was moving. It seemed to come from inside the wall by the living room. Then, over the course of a minute, the sound traveled. It went along the wall, past the doorway to our room, continuing down the hallway, heading toward our son's room. It was the sound of something feeding on the dampness in the walls, on the old wood, on the fear in the air. We listened, helpless, as the wet chewing sound moved past us and stopped right outside his door. Then it stopped altogether. The next morning, my son was listless, almost gray. He picked at his food. I tried to talk to him, to pull him back to me. Buddy, what do you feel like? What can Dad do? He looked at me with eyes that were too old for his face. He's not in all the walls, he said, his voice a tiny thread of sound. Just the wet ones. He showed me. There's a wet path. He slid off his chair and took my hand. He led me not to his room, but to our bathroom. He walked up to the wall behind the toilet, reached out his small hand, and placed his palm flat against the white tiles. He looked at me waiting. I knelt down and put my own hand next to his. The wall was cold. Not just cool, but cold like a basement stone. And in the very center, right where the pipes would run inside the wall, the tiles were unmistakably damp. Not soaking, but slick with condensation in a way no other wall in the house was. A wet path. It made a horrible logical sense. The thing was tied to moisture, to the plumbing, to the dark, wet veins of the building. That was its highway. I thought of the damp shoe. I thought of the chewing sounds. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something that lived in the decay, that fed on the rot and the damp. And my son in his trances was its map, showing it where the wet places were, showing us where it traveled. I left him with my wife and went back to the blueprints. I traced the plumbing lines, the old pipe chases. They formed a vertical column, a central artery, right through the building's core. And our bathroom, our son's wall, the cavity in our closet, they were all on that column. We weren't just living with a monster. We were living inside its stomach. The closure felt grim but clear. We understood the enemy's nature now. It was a parasite in the building's wet, wooden bones. But the open question was far worse. If it fed on dampness, and it was growing stronger through my son, what did it want to feed on next? We moved from fear to bargaining. I stopped seeing myself as a protector and started seeing myself as a zookeeper trying to pacify a beast in a cage I couldn't see. If it wanted dampness, maybe I could give it dampness. If it was hungry, maybe I could feed it something else. It was a disgusting thought, but we were desperate. My engineer's brain latched onto it. I needed to see the wet path, not just guess at it. So I rented a thermal imaging camera, one of those expensive ones that shows heat in colors. On the little screen, our home looked like a strange, colorful tapestry. The warm spots were yellow and orange, our bodies, the fridge, the stove. The cool spots were blues and purples, the windows, the exterior walls. And there it was, just as my son said, a vertical, snaking line of deep, deep blue, a cold trail, running from the floor below us, up through the bathroom wall, branching into the cavity in our closet, and continuing up into the ceiling toward the unit above. It was a map of the dampness, a road made of cold and wet. Seeing it made it real in a whole new way. That night, I formulated my plan. It felt crazy, like something from a twisted fairy tale. If this thing liked damp, rotting things, if it had kept that wet shoe as some kind of prize, maybe I could give it a better offering. A distraction. I went to the grocery store and felt like a criminal. I bought a big, cheap sponge. I bought a whole container of table salt. And from the butcher counter, I asked for a quart of chicken blood, the kind used for cooking. The butcher didn't even blink. At home, I mixed the salt into the blood until it was a sludgy, briny paste. I soaked the sponge in it until it was bloated and dripping. I wrapped the whole horrible thing in a plastic grocery bag, my stomach turning. This was my peace offering. My wife watched me, her face a mask of horror and exhaustion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice flat. "I'm trying to feed it," I said, not meeting her eyes. "Maybe if it has this, it'll leave him alone." She didn't argue. We were past arguing. That afternoon, with my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest, I opened the closet panel again. The smell of sweet rot wafted out. I took the dripping, bagged sponge and pushed it deep into the cavity, right into the spot where I'd found the shoe. I shoved it back between the studs, into the coldest part of the wet path. "There," I whispered, feeling like an idiot talking to a wall. "Eat that." I closed the panel and nailed it shut this time. We waited. That night, we watched the monitor, expecting the worst. But nothing happened. Our son slept. Really slept, the kind of deep, peaceful sleep we hadn't seen in weeks. No whispers, no crawling, no wet chewing sounds. The next night was the same. A profound, unbroken quiet settled over the apartment. We woke up on the second morning and actually made a real breakfast. We laughed, a shaky, disbelieving laugh. My wife made pancakes. We talked about maybe seeing a movie over the weekend. We let ourselves hope. We started to believe we'd outsmarted it. We'd found a disgusting truce. My son seemed better, too, but in a different way. He wasn't scared, but he was listless, like a battery running down. He said he felt empty. I told myself it was just exhaustion, his little body finally catching up on rest. I pushed away the darker thought that maybe the thing was full for now, and its connection to him was weaker. On the third day of peace, curiosity got the better of me. I had to know. Was the offering gone? Had it worked? I got my crowbar, and while my wife took our son to the park again, I pried the panel open once more. The cold air rushed out, but the smell was different. Less sweet. More metallic, like old blood and salt. I shone my flashlight into the cavity. The space between the studs was empty. The spongy, bloody package was completely gone. A wild, relieved grin started to spread across my face. It worked. It took it. But then the beam of my light caught something else. Lying neatly on the dusty floor of the cavity, arranged in a small, deliberate triangle, were three small, white objects. My smile died. I reached in, my fingers trembling, and picked one up. It was smooth and hard. It was a human baby tooth. A little molar with tiny, jagged roots. I dropped it like it was a hot coal. I stared at the other two, glinting in the light. They were a payment. A trade. It hadn't just accepted my offering. It had left a message. A history. These were from a child. Maybe the little girl next door. Maybe from someone even older. This thing collected pieces of children. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The monitor. The thermal camera was still set up, still recording to a memory card when it detected motion in its field of view. It was pointed at the wall in our son's room. A notification dinged on my phone, still in my pocket from earlier. It was an email alert from the camera's software. Motion detected, 2:14 a.m. With a sinking feeling, I pulled out my phone and opened the attached video file. The timestamp was from last night, during the quiet period. The video was in the green glow of night vision. It showed the thermal overlay, with my son a warm yellow blob asleep in his bed. For a minute, nothing. Then a shape emerged from the left side of the screen, from the direction of our master bedroom closet. It was a long, thin, humanoid blob of the deepest blue. Cold. It moved with a slithering, boneless motion, crawling up the wall inside the stud space. It didn't go toward my son. It slithered up the wall he slept next to, crossed over the top of the doorframe, and came to a stop on the wall shared with our bedroom. The wall right behind the head of our bed. And there it stayed. The cold, blue shape pressed itself against the other side of the plaster, right where our pillows were. It didn't move. It didn't chew. It just stayed there, frozen on the screen, for the remaining 4 hours of the recording. Watching. Listening. While we slept, believing we were safe, it had been right there, on the other side of the wall, its cold presence inches from our heads. It wasn't interested in the salty, bloody sponge in the closet anymore. It had taken that offering, left its grisly tokens, and moved to a new post. It had shifted its attention from the boy to us. The closure was a sickening realization. Our bargain had failed. We hadn't pacified it, we had just changed its menu. The open question, the hook that dug deep into my heart as I stared at the video, was simple and terrifying. Why was it watching us sleep now? What did it want with the parents? The final stage wasn't fear or bargaining. It was recruitment. The thing in the walls wasn't just haunting my son anymore. It was offering him a job. Everything changed after the video. The whispers through our boy stopped being about hunger or scary messages. They became instructions. Clear, calm, and horrifyingly direct. He'd sit up in bed, eyes glazed, and speak in that flat, borrowed tone. "He needs salt," he said one night. "Lots of it. In the bathtub. Fill it with hot water and salt." It sounded like a recipe. My wife, who was breaking down faster than I was, actually nodded. She was so exhausted, so worn to a nub by the constant dread, that a part of her was giving up. "What if he just needs something?" she pleaded with me, her eyes hollow. "What if we give him what he wants? He'll leave us alone. Maybe it's a ritual. Maybe we can finish it." I saw it then, a terrifying acceptance. The entity wasn't just attacking her. It was isolating her, making her its ally. It was splitting us apart, choosing the more pliable host. I refused. I told her we weren't filling any bathtubs. We were getting answers. While she stayed, rocking back and forth on the couch, I went to the end of the wet path. I went to the attic. The access was a locked door in the hallway ceiling on the top floor. I used a screwdriver and a hammer to pop the cheap lock. The ladder came down with a cloud of dust. The air above was hot and still, smelling of ancient insulation and rat droppings. My flashlight cut a wobbly beam through the darkness. It wasn't a normal attic. It was a low, cramped space, a jungle of old wooden beams and pink fiberglass fluff. But in the center, under the peak of the roof, someone had made a clearing. There was a nest, not of an animal, but of a person. Old, moldy rags were piled like a bed. Yellowed newspapers from the 1940s were spread around. And arranged in a semicircle, like a shrine, was a collection of things. My heart clenched. More children's items. A tarnished hairpin. A small, cracked leather ball. A few locks of hair, tied with faded ribbon. And a book. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped with damp. I picked it up with shaking hands, sitting in the dust of this horrible lair. I opened it. The handwriting was neat at first, then became jagged, frantic. The early entries were from a man, a maintenance worker for the building when it was new. He wrote about fixing sinks, unclogging drains. Then the entries changed. "The walls speak to me when the pipes run," one said. "They show me the damp places, the soft wood. It is sweet there." The writing got worse. "The children are the sweetest. Their voices are like cool water. They can hear me in the vents." My skin was crawling. The last few pages were almost unreadable, scrawled in pencil that had dug into the paper. I understand now. The house is alive, and it is young. It is hungry. It needs children to grow. I will be its gatherer. I will bring it sweetness. The final entry was only one line, written in a shaky, triumphant hand. "I am going into the wall now. I will be part of the house forever." He hadn't vanished. He had crawled into the gap, the wet path, and become part of the thing. The building's sickness had a name, a mind. He was the caretaker of its hunger. I ran. I scrambled down the ladder, the journal clutched in my hand. I burst into our apartment. My wife and son were in the kitchen. He was awake, sitting at the table, eating cereal. He looked at me as I entered, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face that was not his smile. His jaw dropped open, and the gravelly, wet voice of the man in the walls filled the room. "You found my book. Good." My wife flinched, staring at our son's face as the thing spoke through it. "Now you understand," the voice grated. "The woman will fill the bath. You will bring the boy to it. It is time for him to come into the wall with me. To be quiet, and forever. My son's small hand reached out and took my wife's hand. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at me. Her face was streaked with tears, but there was a strange calm there, a surrender. Maybe it won't be so bad, she whispered, her voice breaking. To be quiet, to not be afraid anymore. She took a step toward our boy, toward the thing wearing his face. That's when I moved. I stepped between them, putting my body between my wife and my son. I looked into my child's eyes, searching for him in there, behind that awful smile. You can't have him, I said, my voice low and steady, though I was shaking inside. The smile on his face widened, and then the building answered. From every direction, from the air vents, the water pipes, the walls themselves, came a sound. A roaring, scratching, tearing sound, like a million insects scraping at the inside of a coffin. It was deafening. It was the sound of the house itself screaming in rage. The light bulb in the kitchen exploded in a pop of glass. The one in the living room followed. We were plunged into a deep, smothering dark, the only light a pale sliver from a street lamp outside. In that sudden blackness, I felt a change in the air. A cold spot formed right behind me. I felt a puff of air, dank and smelling of wet soil and old newspapers, on the back of my neck. And I heard the voice. Not from my son this time. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, vibrating through the bones of the building, a chorus of that single, grinding whisper. It said, mine. I reached out blindly in the dark, finding my wife's arm and pulling her behind me. I could hear my son breathing, a rapid, frightened panting to reel him, scared and confused. The thing was all around us now, not just in one wall. It was in the fabric of the place. We were standing in its stomach. The journal's words echoed in my head. The house is alive. We couldn't run. We couldn't hide. We had to fight the house itself. In the suffocating dark, with my family huddled behind me, I knew the old rules were gone. This wasn't about ghosts or offerings. This was a war for my family's souls, and the battlefield was the home I had bought to keep them safe. The story ends here with a fierce, desperate stand. The enemy is fully revealed, not as a ghost, but as a living, hungry consciousness woven into the very walls, with its servant speaking through my son. The closure is the final, shocking understanding of what we're truly up against. The open path forward is the fight itself. How do you battle a building that is also a predator, when your own home is the enemy's body?